anger at the process. Hello, I'm Catty Kane. Washington Christian Fraser is back in Westminster for us. The U-turn was inevitable. No matter how many times the Prime Minister told the country that a vote on her Brexit deal would happen tomorrow, the voices of dissent kept growing louder. So today she pulled the plug, or at least she postponed it. She'll now go back to Brussels to try to win reassurances on the fate of the Irish border. Whether the EU is prepared to reopen the withdrawal agreement, though, is highly questionable.
Why would the EU unpick the withdrawal agreement in 2 years of hard work when the British MPs can't decide among themselves what they truly want? Because it's clear the House of Commons is divided into factions and there is no majority for any single way forward. We face a fundamental question, said the Prime Minister today. Does this House want to deliver Brexit?
Many of the most controversial aspects of this deal, including the backstop, are simply inescapable facts of having a negotiated Brexit. Those members who continue to disagree need to shoulder the responsibility of advocating an alternative solution that can be delivered, and do so without ducking its implications. So if you want a second referendum to overturn the result of the first, be honest that this risks dividing the country again.
In Brussels, there's now exasperation. The European Parliament's Brexit coordinator, Guy Verhofstadt, tweeted, "I can't follow anymore. After 2 years of negotiations, the Tory government wants to delay the vote. It's time they make up their mind." The Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, said the withdrawal agreement cannot and will not be reopened.
The withdrawal agreement, including the Irish backstop, is the only agreement on the table. It took over a year and a half to negotiate. It has the support of 28 governments, and it's not possible to reopen any aspect of that agreement without reopening all aspects of it.
A few minutes ago, the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, seemed to be feeling more conciliatory towards Theresa May. Mr Tusk wrote that the EU will not renegotiate the deal, including the backstop, but we are ready to discuss, he said, how to facilitate UK ratification. As time is running out, we will also discuss our preparedness for a no-deal scenario. So what next? Well, in short, all options are open. It could be this deal, or no deal, or an election, or another referendum. After a week of debate and 164 MPs rising to speak in it, we head into the Christmas recess with nothing resolved at all. And if you were thinking, what a pantomime, well, you wouldn't be far off.
Given the statement of the Commission this lunchtime, it's clear that nothing has changed and nothing will change. But the thing that is changing is the view of the British people.
No, it's not.
I know it's nearly the pantomime season, but oh yes, it has. And that is why...
Yes, you'd pay very good money for that on Shaftesbury Avenue, not a long way away. Let me introduce you to Richard Harrington, the Business Minister, and also Lord Peter Lilly. I delicately say one of the grandees of the Conservative Party, so we will get your view how this features over time. Let me start with you, Richard. She's walked them up the hill and she's walked them back down again. We had the DEFRA Secretary out today saying there would definitely be a vote. We had the Scottish Secretary out saying there would definitely be a vote, and then a few hours later, no vote. So what went wrong?
Well, certainly before I start, I should confirm that Peter Lilly is definitely a grandee of our party, to avoid any doubt. However, that was not your question. I think she genuinely assessed the situation this morning and realised that there was a significant amount of opposition within the Conservative Party, the members of the Conservative Party, and that in order to alleviate that opposition she had to go to Brussels, Dublin or wherever to try and get a deal that would placate their fear.
But I knew that, and you knew that last week.
Well, yes, but you remember that the interesting thing is that most of the reasoned opposition to this deal seems to focus on one subject. It seems to have honed down to that, certainly from what members of Parliament say. Peter's shaking his head, he may know more than I, but I can just say from my experience of talking to people...
The backstop?
Yes, and that is the backstop. So she tried, it's a calculated plan to persuade people that the arrangements in that in the current proposals were a way of alleviating their fears on that, and she failed to do that and really took the decision at the last minute to pull it. Only equivalent I can think of is I've been in the middle of storms in aircraft and has the decision just as you're about to land to pull it and go back up again, and that's what she's decided to do.
Yeah, there's quite a row going on across the road tonight about that decision to pull the vote and whether there should have been a vote on the vote, but we'll leave that aside for 1 second. Lord Peter Lilly, you belong, as Ken Clarke put it, to one of the factions in the House of Commons, the Brexit supporting faction, so I'm going to put you on the spot, as Theresa May did today. What alternative do you have?
We have an alternative which isn't mine, which isn't hers, which isn't Jeremy Corbyn's, Donald Tusk's alternative.
That would get a majority. It's got to get a majority across the road.
Well, we'll see about that, but you wouldn't put it to the vote. Donald Tusk rightly said the only alternative, if we keep our manifesto pledges of leaving the single market and leaving the customs union, is a free trade agreement like the Canada one, Canada plus plus plus. That's what we should be looking for. He originally offered it to us for the whole United Kingdom. For some reason the government interpreted it as only being for Great Britain. It must be for the whole Union, and that means that we must get a pledge from all three parties, the Irish government, ourselves and the EU, that they will not erect border posts or carry out checks on the border. All three have said that to their own parliaments, so we know it can be done. And that solves the need for this backstop, as it's called.
Would that get a majority across the road, Richard Harrington?
Well, first of all, I disagree profoundly with what Peter says.
But this is the problem.
You can have as many pluses as you like. I've read the Canada trade agreement. There are 401 pages of exemptions that took 8 years on a literally blow-by-blow with vested interest groups within the EU and within Canada, like any trade agreement, to work out. So it's not an instant solution either. The main thing is that there should not be a hard border. I've seen the border between the United States and Canada. They spent $10 billion on the best technology you can imagine, and still people queue up at the border.
But the
same between Norway and Sweden.
The two of you have perfectly accentuated there the crisis we're in. Because two of you, two very senior figures within the Conservative Party, can't agree on what the way forward is going to be. And we have 109 days, Peter Lilly, to sort it.
But at least I'm talking about a deal that's on offer from the EU. It was offered in March, it was offered again in October. It surely can form the basis of a sensible deal. When we say a Canada-style agreement, Canada started with 10,000 tariffs and had to negotiate their removal. The EU likewise. We start with 0 tariffs. We want to go to 0 tariffs. That doesn't require 500 pages of exemptions.
Jacob Rees-Mogg has said tonight that if she gets rid of the backstop altogether, the problem goes away, that a solution which is not in the withdrawal agreement will not work because it won't be legally binding. So already he's setting down red lines for the backbenchers behind her. Well, even if she gets some tinkering, this is not going to work.
Jacob Rees-Mogg speaks for a minority of the Conservative Party, both parliamentary and a minority
in his group.
So he claims, but they're not a unified group. Everyone's got individual interests and individual views, quite understandably. He claims to speak for 70 people. He does not. This is a minority of a minority. And I can tell Jacob Rees-Mogg and his colleagues, if they keep on like they are, they'll find a second referendum and they will get the most probable vote will remain, and they will have caused it. Jacob Rees-Mogg will have caused us to remain in the European Union, which is not what he wants.
OK. Richard Harrington, Lord Peter Lilly, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Indeed. You know, Cathy, I went to a private screening this morning for Brexit, the Uncivil War, which Channel 4 is about to put out in the new year. They're looking for a date, actually, in between everything that's going on. And I came out from the Uncivil War to the Unholy Mess. And the reason when I was going back to the office, I thought, do you know what? This is the most exhausting real-life roller coaster that any scriptwriter who tried to put this onto the big screen would really struggle to achieve. It changes hour by hour, day by day, week by week. Who could possibly write Brexit the sequel when they come to sit down to do it? Chuka Umunna, the Labour MP, is with me. Wow. Let me put this question to you. There's a lot of people down here saying you should pull a vote of no confidence in this government. Is your party going to do that?
I hope so. We're living in quite extraordinary times. I'm sorry particularly for the British viewers of this show. Your politics is broken, I'm afraid. There's absolute gridlock here. There is an impasse. And frankly, the only way we're going to be able to resolve this is by referring it back to you, the people. The problem is there is just not a consensus on what form of Brexit to pursue. I think there is a consensus. Disagree with Peter Lilly and some of the hard-right members of the Conservative Party that, leaving without...
Well, there's no consensus that we've just seen, but equally there's no consensus in your party either.
No, but the one thing that is within the power of the opposition is to move a motion of no confidence under the Fixed Term Parliament Act 2011, so at least we can test whether the House wants to go to a general election on this. I don't frankly believe there is a two-thirds majority for that. Once that's been disposed of as an avenue down which to go, you're only left with one other, and that is for a people's vote on the Prime Minister's plan, so that we can determine what the will of the people is today in 2018. The problem that we had in terms of the last vote that kicked this whole process off is no one was actually asked the form of Brexit that you want.
But answer me this before I let Cathy jump in. If you are honest, and she's calling for honesty today, and for real alternatives, is it the fact that you just want to stop this?
I've always wanted to.
So even though 17.8 million people voted for Brexit, the biggest democratic exercise we've ever had, you must know what sort of a crisis that would cause out in the country if their views aren't actually respected by MPs across the road.
In her exchanges with us, and I just had an exchange with the Prime Minister in the House of Commons, she went to this very issue. But let's just be absolutely clear. I've never made any secret of the fact I would like to see Brexit stopped. I've also made no secret of the fact that I can't stop it, and people who share my view can't stop it. Ultimately, it has to be for the British people to decide. And yes, there were 17.4 million people who voted to leave the European Union in 2016. There were also 16.1 million people who voted to stay. But the point is, you and I can't know what they want now, in light of all these events, in light of all the new facts. Now, you could say, look, this would damage trust in democracy. It would be incredibly divisive. And I think those are absolutely legitimate questions to raise. But we are a divided country. And I tell you something, if we know something from history, it is that it is a deterioration of the economy in particular that precipitates extremism that would lead to the rise of the far right. Now, if this is the avenue down which we're going to go, and people haven't had a further say on whether they really want to do this, multiply the divisions tenfold.
OK, because you've just come from a tussle with the Prime Minister, I've not given you any direction. Cathy is in that camera, and she's got a question for you.
I'm actually not in that camera, but you'll get there. Chaka, thanks very much for joining us. Listen, from this side of the Atlantic, it feels like kind of Groundhog Day. Some things never seem to change in this whole debate, and one of the things that never seems to change are the counter-arguments, as Christian was suggesting there, to a second referendum. But what struck me today in listening to the debate in Parliament is how often we heard people asking about a second referendum. Do you believe that momentum is shifting in that direction?
I do, actually, and I think for viewers watching this around the world, the reason I think it's moving in that direction is because we're gridlocked. There is complete impasse here. As Christian was just saying, you've got two senior members of the Conservative Party, a former cabinet minister no less, and a sitting minister arguing on national television as if they're in two different parties. That's a very unusual state of affairs. And also, Cathy, I mean, if you look at the polls, increasingly through the poll of polls, if you like, of polls done over the last few months, it's quite clear that in light of everything that's happened, a small majority, I'm not going to overplay it, of the British public do want a say on how we leave the European Union and whether we do so. And increasingly people think, look, the deal that we've got now as a member of the EU is far superior to what has been negotiated.
So the issues that were raised in Parliament today, and that have been raised consistently for the last year and a half, since people have been talking about the prospect of a second referendum, you've just dealt with them, that having them, as the Prime Minister said, would increase division in an already divided country, and that it could undermine democracy, particularly among people who voted for the very first time in that referendum, if their views were not respected. But what about the prospect of whether a second referendum would be respected? So, say you got your people's vote and effectively went back to the country and they voted again to leave the European Union. What guarantee is there that that gets us any further along in this debate?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. And let's not forget, by the way, that there are over 2 million young people who, if we had a people's vote in 6 months' time, would actually be getting their first say over this. who didn't get the vote in 2016 because they weren't old enough, and they're going to be living with the consequences of this for far longer than any of the rest of us. But let's go to the heart of the democratic question you asked.
You would accept the result if it came back the same? You would accept the result if it came back the same?
I think the difference between 2016 and 2018 is that in 2016 we were dealing with a hypothetical question as to what would happen if we voted to leave the European Union. And it was all speculation on both sides. Now we actually know the reality of what we can get in a negotiation and what leave will look like in a way that we didn't before. So I think that is the key difference in this. And ultimately, I mean, you asked the question around democracy. I don't see how you can thwart the will of the people if ultimately it is the people who get to determine this thing. As I just said to Christian, I'd love to stop Brexit. I've not lied about that or been dishonest about that. But ultimately, the British people have to decide that. And when they do, if they're in the ballot booth, I'm not sitting in there. Richard Harrington, the minister, is not sitting in there. Peter Lilly's not sitting in there. It's an individual, secret ballot of every single citizen of our country. That's how democracy works. And look, we have general elections every 4 to 5 years. We have regional and local elections in this country, just as you do over there in the States, on a yearly basis. Democracy isn't static. We can't shut down debate. We've got to have it.
Chuck Umunna, well done. Without any direction whatsoever, you did that brilliantly. Speaking to Washington. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for
it's very
having
good to have you with us here. Just watching, actually, Cathy, the pictures live from the Commons. The Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom, is on her feet telling MPs why they're not going to get a vote on the vote. 164 MPs have stood up over the course of the last week, and they're not going to get to vote on the debate that they've been listening to. Quite a night.
Yeah. And still a lot of questions about what she can come back with from Brussels that sweetens the pill enough to make that withdrawal agreement any more acceptable than it clearly is not at the moment. There is one other job, Christian, right now that seems almost as undesirable as that of the British Prime Minister, the White House Chief of Staff.
Yes.
Following the announced departure of General John Kelly, Mr. Trump appears to be having trouble filling what is normally seen as a plum position here.
News broke over the weekend that his first choice, Nick Ayres, who currently serves as Mike Pence's Chief of Staff, turned the spot down. And that may be because Mr. Trump has fired more Chiefs of Staff in his first 2 years than any other president. There is not much longevity here.
Yeah, so what qualities does the ideal candidate have? Here's what it takes to replace John Kelly. Can you pledge your loyalty until 2020? Can you keep control of chaotic situations? They sometimes arise. Do you have gravitas? And are you prepared to speak truth to power in the Oval Office? For more now, we're joined by Ron Christie, former advisor to George W. Bush. I am struggling to think that George Bush might have had problems filling the job of Chief of Staff, Ron.
Good afternoon, Catty. No, he never would have had problems filling the Chief of Staff position. This is the second most important position in Washington, D.C. Someone who has the gravitas to speak on behalf of the president, to be able to fire members of the cabinet, and someone who can manage up as well as manage down to the staff. And all the attributes that you just listed of what is needed to replace General Kelly, who in their right mind in this town would want to take this job at this point?
So one of the people that's being suggested is a conservative Republican, Mark Meadows. He's leader of one of the conservative groups, the Freedom Caucus here in the House of Representatives. He has said that actually it would be an honor for anybody to have that job. Is he the right kind of person? Does somebody who leads a big conservative movement, part of the president's base, fit the bill? Perhaps more than a general?
No. Mark Meadows is the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, about 40 or 45 conservative members of the House of Representatives. You need someone, and I think the graphic said it best, gravitas. Someone who instantly comes to the job, respected by members of Congress as well as members of the administration. Mr. Meadows comes with some baggage. Mr. Meadows comes as a controversial figure, a lightning rod. The last thing you need, Catty, at this juncture is yet another lightning rod in a very chaotic White House.
Gee, Catty, I'm looking around for people who are respected by Congress, people who've worked for former presidents, looking for people who might be just kicking their heels a bit at the moment, might be able to get in the White House. Can you think of anybody like that?
I can't, no,
okay.
You mean some perhaps work for George W. Bush, perhaps somebody like that?
Somebody like that would be ideal, wouldn't he? Yeah. No, let me ask you this, Ron. I'm teasing.
Ron is about to shoot you, Christian.
I'm looking for the back door to run out of.
The last line on our CV that we just had there, the next Chief of Staff, was must be able to speak truth to power. I'm not sure that's a good thing for a chief of
line.
staff that works for Donald Trump, because those that speak truth to power in the Oval Office at the moment, they get short, sharp shrift.
Good evening, Christian. They sure do. And that's perhaps the most important thing that I learned from the two chiefs of staff that I worked with, Andy Card and Josh Bolton. You have to be able to look the President of the United States in the eye and say, sir, you're wrong. Here's why going this direction is the wrong way to go about it. And this is what the majority of the cabinet thinks. I do not believe that Donald Trump wants to listen to any one individual tell him why he is wrong about anything. So, yeah, the notion that you can give truth to power to Donald Trump, I just don't buy it.
Ron, I know that the President has sometimes suggested he doesn't actually want a chief of staff, that he thinks he wants to run the Oval Office the way he wants to run it, and he doesn't like the kind of restrictions that that job can place on his ability to call people and chat to his mates and have people come into the Oval Office. But look, he's about to have the Democrats take over the House. The Mueller investigation is winding up. There could be a whole slew of other investigations. This is a critical position, isn't it, for him to fill properly for the next 2 years?
Critical and crucial, Kathy. The last time we had a President of the United States who did not have a chief of staff initially was Gerald Ford, and we saw the disaster of that coming out of Watergate. Mr. Trump needs someone who can manage the staff so that we don't have the internal strife that we've seen before General Kelly got there, as well as manage him. At this juncture, I just honestly can't tell you who that person's going to be.
Okay, Ron Christie, who is not applying for a job in the White House anytime soon.
Think of the book.
Like.
Think of the book, Ron.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but think of the headaches that would go with it. Let's return to the main story this hour. The British Prime Minister has called off Tuesday's crucial vote on her Brexit deal. Theresa May is now going to go back to Brussels and ask for changes to her agreement.
MPs have reacted angrily to her announcement, with Labour's Jeremy Corbyn saying she had lost control of events. I'm pleased to say the former chairman of the Conservative Party, Grant Shapps, has joined me up here. Can she go to Brussels on Thursday, Grant Shapps, and find something that is going to satisfy her many critics on the backbenches?
I think we need to see, but I suspect the answer is no.
So what then?
Well, I mean, this deal needs to be voted on at some point. I was one of the 164 who've spoken during the course of this debate, which should have run the rest of today and tomorrow. The House was clearly going to turn it down with, I think, about 150 majority against it, so it was going to be pretty catastrophic. Quite easy to see why she's called it off. The problem is, I don't think she's going to be able to go to Brussels and bring back something which is going to convince sufficient numbers to bring that majority down to a majority for her rather than a majority against.
So it seems to me what we have here is a lack of trust on both sides. There's a lack of trust on the European side that anything they give her, however small it may be, could get a majority across the road. And there's a lack of trust over here that the EU wouldn't keep the UK in a backstop indefinitely. And that seems the insurmountable problem with just 100 days left.
I think there's another problem as well, which is that colleagues here in Parliament are probably only going to accept a deal that she gets written into that legally binding withdrawal agreement. And everyone is saying, and you've been reporting this afternoon, the EU saying, we will not reopen that withdrawal agreement. And so if it's just a form of words, which, is, sounds nice, maybe a bit like that political, non-binding political declaration, that's not going to cut it with the kind of mood that I'm hearing in the Commons, in the tea rooms, in the dining rooms, in the chamber right now, where MPs are just saying, actually, we will not take a deal which is anything other than copper bottom, that means written into law.
So it's legally binding, Cathy. That's the point.
Yeah, so Mr. Shapps, is there anything Theresa May can now do in the course of the next 3 days as she heads back to Brussels? We don't exactly know when she's going to go, but we're assuming before Thursday, that you think Brussels is prepared to give, that she could come back and get a majority in the House on?
Well, I suspect her best bet is to go back to Brussels and then say to them, look, this is not going to go through. If you want no deal Brussels, then that's what you're going to get here. The only way we can get this through the House is to have it written into the withdrawal agreement. And what about if we take a bit more time to complete that process to get that done? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean time delaying the 29th of March. That could just be time into January. And then she'd come back to the House. Theresa May would come back to the House on Monday when she'd be reporting back. That would always normally happen. She'll be reporting back to the House and she'll say, actually, I'm going to do this again in the new year and ask you to vote on it once it's in the withdrawal agreement. But I have to say, we've really run out of road. She's found, famously, she's kicked the can down the road. She's found a bit more gravel track to kick the can a little bit further. But I don't think there's much road left.
Grant Shapps, good of you to join us. Thanks very much indeed. This is Beyond 100 Days from the BBC.
And coming up for viewers on the BBC News Channel and BBC World News, we'll go to Brussels to talk more about the reaction of the European Union to that delayed Brexit vote in Parliament. Stay with us for that, coming up in just a moment.
Hello. After the wet, windy weather we had at the end of last week into the start of the weekend, something much quieter to come through much of the week ahead. Looked pretty nice on the coast of North Yorkshire this afternoon, and it was eastern parts of the UK that ended the day with some sunny spells, whereas in the west, this weather front has been moving in. It's very weak, but it has been producing thicker cloud, seen some patchy rain in Northern Ireland and now into parts of Scotland. And that's draped across western parts overnight. Anywhere underneath this could see a bit of light rain or drizzle. Some hill fog is possible too, whereas there are some of us in northern and eastern areas of Scotland and down the eastern side of England that will have some clear spells, and you can see the blue here indicating this is where we'll see the lowest temperatures overnight, at or maybe a couple of degrees below freezing in the coldest spots, so we'll see a frost here. Elsewhere the temperatures stay several degrees above freezing where you've got the cloud cover. Into tomorrow then, and it will be parts of northern Scotland, the Northern Isles, easternmost areas of England, especially into Norfolk, that see some sunny spells, maybe a few brighter moments too towards Wales and the southwest. But it'll pick out this zone of thicker cloud here. That's that weather front we saw earlier that could still be producing a bit of light rain and drizzle here and there. It's quite chilly the further east you are, but temperatures in double figures for some of us in the west. But another weather front coming in from the west to end the day, bringing some outbreaks of rain towards Northern Ireland, parts of Wales and southwest England. But notice how that just grinds to a halt. High pressure building in Scandinavia, blocking Atlantic weather systems coming in for the remainder of the week. We will keep one though just lingering through western areas on Wednesday. Northern Ireland, you may be to the west of that, seeing some sunshine. Still northeast Scotland, parts of eastern England with some brighter spells, and temperatures are starting to come down. The colder feel on a southeasterly wind, and seeing southeasterly wind around this area of high pressure in Scandinavia. You can see the arrows here, and the colder feel will be enhanced by that brisk wind on Thursday. But there'll be a lot of dry weather around. There may not be a huge amount of sunshine, mind you. There'll be some of us brightening up a bit. The main thing though for Thursday and Friday, those temperatures rooted in single figures, mid single figures in places too. Now it looks as if it's early days yet. It looks as if the Atlantic will take over again on Saturday with rain, maybe some snow on the leading edge, pushing north, windier again too.
Join Simon McCoy as he brings you the top stories live.
The ball is entirely in the UK's court. We could have got our tennis correspondent to report on this.
The latest in sport.
Heaven knows how they're dealing with this on the court.
The heat or the wind? I'm not quite sure.
Or both.
The day's weather.
It's getting colder.
And undeniable chemistry.
He's still laughing.
We have to talk to each other.
There's only one Simon.
So you're the real McCoy.
Afternoon Live with Simon McCoy, weekdays at 2 p.m. on the BBC News Channel.
Some days of the week are just different. Upgrade your tech, apps and gadget knowledge. Click this weekend on the BBC News Channel.
Say daddy. Papa. Say mama.
Papa. What happens in the first 2 years of life lays the foundation for everything to come.
A baby is born with about 50 trillion connections in their brain.
You can see the brainwaves changing in real time.
No, don't touch.
We're about to discover the complexity and sheer genius of how we all grow up.
How you became you. Babies, their wonderful world. Continues tonight at 9.
You're watching Beyond 100 Days.
Our top stories. Here there is turmoil in Westminster as the British Prime Minister delays the crucial vote on her Brexit deal at the 11th hour. Did Donald Trump direct his former lawyer to make hush payments on his behalf? If true, a top Democrat says it could be an impeachable offence.
Also on the programme, after a month of unrest across France, President Macron goes on TV to address the nation and says he believes he can find a way out of the current problems. And the story of one journalist sick of being called the wrong name by her colleagues and what she did about it.
Hello, I'm Christian Fraser in Westminster. Katty Kay is in Washington. It is Brexit chaos here in London at the moment, with Prime Minister Theresa May deciding today to delay that parliamentary vote on her deal to leave the European Union. The decision has not been met, fair to say, with favour in the House of Commons, where members of Parliament are now pushing the main opposition, the Labour Party, to present a motion of no confidence against the Prime Minister.
And while all this is happening in Westminster, on the other side of the Channel, the European Union seems to be losing its patience today. Several representatives of the EU came out again to make it crystal clear that it's either this deal or no deal at all.
Well, with me is Nicky Morgan, Conservative Chair of the House of Commons Treasury Committee. It's good to have you with us. You are one of those MPs not very happy about the parliamentary process tonight, the fact that there will be no vote.
Yes, look, I think the country had kind of been gearing itself up for a vote, and certainly members of Parliament had been. Committees like mine have been looking at the economic analysis prepared by the government, the Bank of England, last week. And the trouble is, actually, does a delay help to reach a compromise? And that's what's going to be needed, is building a parliamentary consensus. I think we should give the Prime Minister time to go to Brussels to see what can be potentially agreed. But, colleagues on all sides of the House are going to have to think very, very carefully when we do get a vote, and we will at some point get a vote.
We should remind people that Parliament voted earlier this year on the Withdrawal Act, which is the date on which the UK will leave the European Union, March 29th, 2019. That is statute, that is law.
Yep.
And to overturn that, you need more statute.
Absolutely.
And it's your feeling, we were talking off air during the break, it's your feeling that that's not straightforward.
Well, I think the trouble is that there are all sorts of competing interests in the House of Commons. So obviously you'd have a lot of people who are very much in favour of Brexit, particularly a hard Brexit with no deal, who would not want the date to be overturned. Then, of course, you've got the Labour Party, whose main goal is to have a general election, so they just want chaos all round, as do some of the opposition parties. And so any legislation you've got to pass runs the risk of being defeated. Whether it's on the date, whether it's on having a second vote, whether it's even on withdrawing the motion that we were going to vote on tomorrow.
So when your colleague Amber Rudd says, oh no, there's no majority in the House of Commons for no deal, that may be the case, but getting a majority for the statute to overturn the Withdrawal Act, that might be a different thing.
Well, the issue with that, Amber is absolutely right, there is no majority for no deal. I think most people in the House of Commons, and I think many in the country, realise the economic chaos that would cause. But the issue is, it's not just enough to say no to no deal. You've got to put something else in place in order to have something for people to vote for.
That is quite an issue, Katty.
Nick Morgan, you wrote earlier that the problem is that those people who are going out opposing the Prime Minister's deal effectively not being candid about what the alternatives are. We heard that repeatedly from the Prime Minister. It seemed to be the theme, really, of the debate today. Be honest about what those alternatives are. But do you think that the Prime Minister can come back from Brussels with something that could now win a majority in the House, if people are honest about the fact that none of the other proposals on the table at the moment do have that majority?
Well, look, I think there are certainly some of my colleagues on the Conservative benches who have made it very clear they don't like the backstop for the reason of not having the UK, not having a unilateral right to get out of it. I don't know whether there's any possible movement on that. There may not be, but I know that some of my colleagues have been looking for ways to see some movement that would give them the opportunity to say, OK, the Prime Minister has secured some movement, I can now support it. So I think we will have to see what she comes back with. But, it is difficult, obviously, to see exactly where we go from here. But the Prime Minister's right. If you vote down the deal, this is a deal that enables the UK to leave the EU. So, for example, for someone like me who didn't want us to leave in the first place, I have now come to accept that actually 17 million people did vote for that. So actually the question is, yes, we're going to leave. How do we make sure that we don't cause any more economic damage than you already would in negotiating a new trading relationship? And she's right to say that if this deal gets voted down, then the chances are you either end up with perhaps a second referendum, which could lead to a no Brexit, or you end up with a no deal Brexit, which the House of Commons says also that it doesn't want. So all the choices are unpalatable.
OK. Nicky Morgan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's rather cold up here, so thank you for being patient with us and standing tight. The former chair of the Prime Minister's Policy Board, George Freeman, is going to join us very shortly. But I can see him in the wings. But while we wait for him, do we have Gavin Lee in Brussels? I thought we were going to go to Gavin Lee in Brussels. No?
No, we'll try and get that from Brussels later on in the programme. Because I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, watching Brussels today, Christian, and the degree to which they're trying to choose their words very carefully about what kind of well, they're saying no renegotiation, but some sort of concession or reaffirmation or reassurance. I mean, the language around this is as Byzantine perhaps as the process itself, and you're trying to read tea leaves in Brussels. But do you think that Brussels is going to come up with something that would satisfy people there, enough people there? Well, as you know well, Cathy, my feet, my size 9s are imprinted into the carpet on that balcony in Brussels, so I've stood through a few But you've always said at the last minute, you have always said, Christian Fraser, that at the last minute they will do it.
Yeah, I always think that at the last gasp they do find a practical solution, and I'm still an optimist that they might do that. But let's find out from the man who knows, Gavin Lee, who's been gathering some response from Brussels today. So we hear from Donald Tusk that he's going to call Thursday a Brexit summit day, which he wasn't going to do. So that shows at least they're open to discussing it, Gavin.
Yeah, it's a good start. And we flipped a bit in terms of this morning when the foreign ministers from all of the EU countries arrived here in Brussels, and each one of them that I spoke to, I must have spoke to a dozen or more of the 27, they all said the same thing. You could have pretty much copied and pasted the responses. We will not renegotiate if it comes to it. We've done everything. It's taken 2 years. Even the Spanish Foreign Minister Josep Borrell said on the issue of Gibraltar, which was so difficult, and we sweated, we bled to get this deal, he said, we're not going to reopen it. Now, Donald Tusk today of the European Council tweeting, he waited until Theresa May had spoken this evening, and he said that, like you say, they'll discuss this on Thursday, there'll be a Brexit meeting, but he said there'll be no renegotiation, particularly on this idea of a backstop, an insurance policy to make sure there's no hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And he did say they'd help facilitate the UK. And I think, Christian and Cathy, it comes down to language. You know, Theresa May's talking about a reassurance from the EU, and the EU are talking about helping to facilitate but not renegotiate. Yeah. I tell you what, personally, look, Gavin, there are a lot of diplomats... Go on, tell me.
Yeah, you speak Brussels. I do not speak Brussels. What does facilitate UK ratification mean?
OK, that means we may be open to talk in non-legal terms. So when it comes to the withdrawal agreement, the idea of this divorce deal, which was a more than 580-page legal document which ensures the treaty for Britain to leave the EU in March next year, they won't touch that. They'll talk about extra sort of maybe text on what they call the political declaration, the vision for the future, which is not legal. So it's reassuring terminology, and frankly, whether you parlez-vous Bruxellois or not, if you do or don't speak Brussels here, I think everybody's a little flummoxed by A, what Theresa May is asking for now here, and B, what they can actually give here. The two haven't yet met. And bear this in mind briefly as well. Think about this side of the water. How fragile Europe seems to many other countries. You have Emmanuel Macron, as we know, has spoken tonight with the protests in France. You have Sweden with no government. You have Hungary and Poland, the bad boys of Europe, with action taken by the European Commission here about whether they're addressing issues of human rights there. You have Spain with the Vox Populist Party they're concerned about. They wanted to be wrapping Christmas presents, having a brief moment to settle by the fire for December. Now this is going into January. They wanted it out of the way.
Gavin, never underestimate what a bit of parlez-vous can do, although it helps if you can sprechen Sie Deutsch as well, they tell me. Sorry for the confusion a little earlier. I know. Well, it is a little bit like being the Speaker of the House today. They're coming through one by one. I've got the former chair of the Prime Minister's Policy Board, George Freeman, who's joined me. Thank you very much for coming across the road. It's quite an active debate over there. A lot of anger that they're not getting a vote. What do you think of what you've seen today?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of synthetic anger, actually. This is the House shroud waving. I think everyone knows they're going to get a vote and they're going to get their say, and I'm pleased about that, having voted for the meaningful vote last year. Look, in the end, this is about whether the Prime Minister can get a Brexit deal through Parliament. I think we should have a free vote. I think the idea that this is convenient to any political party is for the birds, and I think it's time that Parliament is given a chance to decide. And I hope the Prime Minister can come back from Brussels with something, some improvement that reassures those who are struggling.
About that?
Well, I think the real issue is the DUP. I've got some colleagues in my party who clearly would rather have no deal and are going to vote against it. But the DUP, I think, have signalled that they are up for a sensible Brexit deal, but they're very concerned about the implications of this draft on their position in the United Kingdom. And that, I think, is where the Prime Minister needs to focus.
So you think if she can get something that reassures them on the backstop, their 10 votes, the loyalists within the Conservative Party plus some Labour MPs, she can get this over the line. That's your optimistic view.
Well, it's a possibility.
Because Nicky Morgan has just been here saying there's a lot of people who don't want this to work, that they're crying foul because they actually would like this to be a no deal at the end of the day.
I think the most likely thing is the first vote in Parliament on a deal will be rejected. And I think the real challenge is for the Prime Minister, what do you do then? And my advice to her would be, at that point, you need to put aside any idea that this is a party political vote, respect the voice of Parliament, and put a proposal that has a chance of getting through. And I still think that the EFTA Norway model with cross-party support could get through. But I have to say, the way we're heading at the moment, it feels very much as though we're heading for a new year where no deal becomes very likely, and I think that will drive Parliament to vote probably for a second referendum unless we can find a deal.
Interesting.
So, Mr. Freeman, we're now getting some sense of the Prime Minister's movement. She's going to be in The Hague tomorrow morning, meeting with the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, and so I guess she'll go on from that to Brussels to carry on these negotiations. I just don't see this language, facilitate UK ratification, that's coming out of the EU, how that's going to satisfy the DUP. Aren't they going to demand something firmer than the European Union is prepared to give Theresa May?
Yes, I think that's probably right.
That's the problem, right?
Yeah, that is exactly the problem, and I think the DUP are going to make very clear that anything that puts a border down the Irish Sea is not acceptable to them. And I suspect the Prime Minister will come back possibly with an amendment, but I suspect it won't be enough, and I think we should have that vote. And I think the Prime Minister should say Parliament must have its say. I'd make it a free vote, and then I think we will have moved forward in this next stage, and in the new year Parliament will have to decide what it wants to do.
It's been none of you that have been up here tonight. We've had what, five Conservative MPs up here tonight. Not one of you's talked about a leadership contest.
I think a leadership contest now would send completely the wrong message. I think the public would look in with horror. Look, in the end, Parliament created this problem. Parliament voted for a referendum. Parliament asked the people, and Parliament has somehow got to take their instruction and put it into practice. I think if we were to suddenly go off on a leadership election, the public would look on with horror. I think one is coming. I think it should be in the summer. Personally, I would prefer us, if the Prime Minister runs out of room and cannot get any room for manoeuvre, then I think we may be in the territory of a caretaker who would see if they can get through this last stage of withdrawal. And I think a leadership election must come later in the year. But for now, we've got 3 months and we've got a crisis.
And crack on. George, nice to see you. Pleasure. Thanks very much. George Freeman there. In less than a month.
Yeah, as we said at the beginning of the programme, right, Christian, 109 days. Tomorrow it will be 108. That gets through pretty quickly, throwing Christmas and New Year, and time is running out.
Yeah.
In less than a month, talking of time running out, Democrats will take over control of the House of Representatives, and with that comes all the powerful chairmanships of some pretty key committees. The power to investigate, and yes, possibly even start impeachment proceedings, will rest in Democrats' hands.
After the filing of court documents on Friday, many Democrats pounced on the payments Michael Cohen made to 2 women to silence their accusations of affairs with Mr. Trump as implicating the president. Here is what Jerry Nadler, the incoming head of the Judiciary Committee, had to say.
They would be impeachable offences. Whether they are important enough to justify an impeachment is a different question, but certainly they'd be impeachable offences because even though they were committed before the president became president, they were committed in the service of fraudulently obtaining the office. That would be that would be an impeachable offence.
Jerry Nadler there, the Democrat, will take over the Judiciary Committee. Joining us now from New York is former US Congresswoman Nan Hayworth. Ms. Hayworth, thanks very much for joining us. You have been a supporter of Donald Trump's, and I wonder where you are today after the midterm election losses with the Democrats taking over the House of Representatives, all that we are hearing from the Mueller investigation, all that we are hearing from the Southern District of New York. Is there anything in all of this that has made you concerned about the president's future?
No, not in terms of really, Caddy, if you look at, number one, Russian collusion, nothing has been proven despite 2 years of effort. Caddy, nothing that was in the filings on Friday indicated that there's any pattern that can be put together to the president's disadvantage. In terms of, yes, there is much talk about Michael Cohen and the payments that went to Ms. McDougal and to Ms. Daniels. But bear in mind, and much is already being written about this, but bear in mind that these were payments, and the president contends strongly that he did not have relationships with these women, but that aside, these were payments that were done to, yes, you know, to facilitate their silence. There is a pattern among many prominent people of providing monetary payments to people whom they want not to sully their reputation inside or outside of a campaign context.
That's not ideal in a president, is it?
Oh, it's a fact of life among prominent people, Caddy. It has nothing to do with the portfolio of policies that the president was elected to carry out. You know, if we're talking about what a prominent person does privately, and this, of course, is what the president was indicating earlier today. These were actions that he would have taken with or without a presidential campaign going on. And I think that will be his argument, and it is one that I think he can make quite effectively from a legal standpoint. So no, am I worried about the president's risk of being impeached over the next 2 years? I am not, for many reasons, nor do I believe that the president would successfully be pursued in that way, even if the numbers in the Senate somehow favored a vote, which of course favored a conviction, which will not be the case, as we know. So I think it would be best for the Democrats and my friend Jerry Nadler, whom I know, to move on from this and try to get something done actually for the American people who do not care about any of these issues nearly as much as they do about border security, the economy, and other crucial concerns.
Do they not, Nan? They don't care that he had much deeper contact with Russians well into his presidential campaign, which he wasn't honest about, at a time when Russian agents were trying to influence their vote and his campaign. They don't care about that?
There's no evidence. Number one, no, people are not concerned about those things because, frankly, there's no evidence that the president was in any way influenced by, dealing with in any means that would affect his campaign or his success in pursuing the office. Let's bear in mind that the traffic with Russia was pursued very vigorously by Democratic operatives. Christopher Steele, who was paid by Democrats to create a fake dossier, had much contact with Russia. So if anything, you know, the pattern that we're seeing is that the Democratic side and the Hillary Clinton campaign were dealing in ways that were meant to try to influence the election and influence the course of this presidency.
Former Congresswoman Nan Hayworth, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, Nan. Let's go to France. There is a lot of chaos around the world at the moment. Let's go to France. Emmanuel Macron has made a national television address in a bid to end the violent protests that have rocked France for the past 3 weeks. He's already ditched a planned hike in the fuel tax, but that wasn't enough to diffuse anger at his government. And his tax cuts for wealthy is equally unpopular.
Yeah, more than 130,000 protesters took to the streets this weekend with their trademark yellow vests. Many of them want the president to resign. Mr. Macron is seen as arrogant, out of touch with economic concerns of voters. Tonight he admitted that he has made some mistakes.
Je prends ma part de cette responsabilité.
I take my share of the responsibility, and I'm aware that there is a feeling that I am not worried, that I have other priorities. I also know that I've caused issues for some of you with my reforms, but let me be clear tonight. If I have fought to reform the political system, the bad habits, the hypocrisy, it is because I love and